There's something different about people who were the oldest child. Because this wasn't just a birth order position. It forged a specific psychological pattern that researchers are only now beginning to decode. Let's start with something most people get completely wrong. When we think about oldest children, we assume they had it easier, more attention, fewer responsibilities. But the oldest child experience reveals that assumption is backwards. Think about it. You're 5 years old, sitting on the couch next to your mum, and she's holding your new baby sibling. And someone, an aunt or family friend, leans down and says those words you'll hear 1,000 more times. You're the big kid now. You need to set a good example. You didn't ask for this job. You didn't apply to be the prototype child. But suddenly, without warning, you went from being the baby to being the example, from receiving full attention to sharing it, from making mistakes privately to making them in front of an audience who would learn from watching you. And here's what happened in your brain during those early years. Every time your parents corrected you, every time they said your brother is watching or your sister copies everything you do, your neural pathways were building something specific. A hyper-awareness of being observed. You'd be playing in your room and hear your little sibling crying. Before your mum even called your name, you'd already be calculating, should I go help? Will I get in trouble if I don't? What if I'm doing something wrong right now that they're learning? This constant state of being watched wasn't paranoia, it was reality. And it created what psychologists call developed observational awareness. You learned early that your actions had ripple effects beyond yourself, that you were always, in some way, performing. Now imagine you're 8 years old, sitting at the dinner table. Your dad is explaining the rules about bedtime, about homework, about screen time. And you're listening carefully because you know what comes next. These rules apply to you first. You're the beta test for the family system. You couldn't argue, but so-and-so gets to stay up until 9 because you were the so-and-so. You were setting the precedent. If you got to watch an hour of TV, your siblings would expect the same. If you got punished for something, that behavior was now officially banned for everyone who came after. This wasn't unfair. It was being the first draft. And it created something unexpected, a deep understanding that fairness isn't always about equal treatment. It's about different people needing different things at different times. While other birth orders might focus on their own individual experience, oldest children developed systems thinking early. They understood family dynamics as an ecosystem where one person's privileges or punishments affected everyone else. They learned to think in terms of precedent, consequence, and cascading effects. Psychologists call this ecological awareness. But for you, it was just knowing that nothing you did existed in isolation. But this ability to see cascading effects created an unexpected problem that researchers are only now connecting to oldest child burnout patterns. Because when you can see how every choice ripples outward, you can never make a decision that's purely about you. Let's talk about those moments when you wanted to quit something. Piano lessons you hated. Soccer practice you dreaded. That club you joined because it sounded good but turned out to be boring. You're sitting with your parents, trying to explain that you want to stop. And they say something like, well, what kind of message does that send to your brother? He just started lessons because he looks up to you, so you stayed. Not because you wanted to, not because you loved piano or soccer or whatever activity, but because quitting meant you were teaching someone else that quitting was acceptable. This wasn't manipulation, it was responsibility, and it created a specific psychological pattern. Oldest children learned that their choices were never entirely their own, that personal preferences took a back seat to modeling behavior. Years later, in jobs, in relationships, in life, these are the people who stay in difficult situations longer than they probably should. Not because they're martyrs or doormats, but because they learned young that endurance matters, that finishing what you start isn't about you, it's about what you're showing others is possible. What researchers call elevated persistence threshold sounds clinical, but you just knew that giving up wasn't really an option when someone was watching you to learn how to handle hard things. Fast forward to a random Tuesday afternoon. Your parents need to run errands. They look at you and say, watch your sister for an hour, we'll be right back. You're 10, maybe 11. Your sibling is 6 or 7, and suddenly you're in charge. Not playing together, not hanging out, in charge. You make them a snack. You settle an argument about what to watch on TV. You make sure they don't do anything dangerous. And when your parents come home, they don't praise you extensively. They just say thanks like you did something normal. This pattern repeated hundreds of times throughout your childhood. Before you could drive, you were responsible for another human being. Before you had your own life figured out, you were managing someone else's immediate needs. This wasn't parentification. It was leadership training before you knew you were learning it. And here's what got wired into your brain: authority before you were ready for it. You learned to make decisions when you didn't feel qualified, to project confidence when you felt uncertain, to be the calm presence even when you were anxious inside. While other kids were still in pure childhood, oldest children were getting repetitions in a skill that most people don't develop until their 20s or 30s. How to be responsible for outcomes that affect other people. What psychologists call premature authority integration was just you making sure your little brother didn't stick a fork in the electrical outlet while your parents were at the grocery store. And here's what nobody tells you about developing leadership skills this early. It comes with a psychological cost that shows up decades later in the most unexpected ways. Now let's talk about the moment you got in trouble for something. Really in trouble. Maybe you failed a test. Maybe you snuck out. Maybe you lied about something important. Your parents' disappointment wasn't just about you. It was laced with something else. Concern about what this meant for your siblings. What if they think this is okay? What if they follow your example? Your mistake wasn't private, it was instructional. Your failure became a teaching moment for someone else before you'd even processed it yourself. This wasn't cruelty. It was the reality of being first. And it created something psychologically complex. You learned that your mistakes had an audience. That getting caught wasn't just about consequences for you, it was about what message it sent to the younger kids watching. So you developed something researchers call anticipatory guilt, the ability to feel bad about something before you even do it, based on imagining how it might influence others. While other birth orders might take risks and deal with consequences after, oldest children learn to pre-calculate the ripple effects, to consider not just will I get in trouble, but what will this teach my siblings about what's acceptable. This created adults who are intensely aware of how their behavior affects systems around them, who think 3 steps ahead about consequences, who sometimes struggle to be spontaneous because they're always calculating downstream effects. But that calculating mind became useful in unexpected ways. Picture holiday time. The family is gathering, plans are being made, and somehow, without anyone officially assigning the role, you're the one coordinating everything. You're texting siblings about what time everyone can arrive. You're checking with parents about dietary restrictions. You're making sure someone picks up the thing that needs to be picked up. You're mediating between family members who have conflicting preferences. No one asked you to project manage Thanksgiving, but you did it anyway. Because somewhere deep in your psychology, you learned that if you don't organize the system falls apart. This wasn't control freakishness. It was pattern recognition. You watched what happened when nobody coordinated, when everyone assumed someone else would handle logistics, when plans fell through because no one took ownership. So you became the person who takes ownership, not because you love administrative tasks, but because you learned young that someone has to make sure all the pieces fit together, and that someone was usually you. What researchers call default leadership assumption sounds fancy, but you were just making sure everyone knew what time dinner was. But the calculating mind that made you good at organizing had a darker side that psychologists are calling the responsibility trap. Because when you're the one who always steps up, you never learn how to let things fall apart. Then came those moments in school where you watched your younger siblings struggle with something you'd already been through. The hard teacher, the difficult subject, the social situation you remembered navigating. Your parents would look at you and say, "Can you help them with this? You already know how to do it." So you became a teacher before you were ready to teach. You explained concepts you just barely mastered yourself. You translated your own recent struggles into advice for someone 3 steps behind you on the same journey. This pattern of learning, something then immediately having to teach it, created a unique relationship with knowledge. You couldn't just absorb information passively. You had to understand it well enough to explain it to someone else. This wasn't burden. It was accelerated mastery that most people don't get until adulthood. What psychologists call recursive learning This process of learning, then teaching, is one of the most effective ways to achieve deep understanding. But for oldest children, it wasn't a study technique, it was just how family worked. These are the people who, decades later, are naturally good at mentoring, who can break down complex ideas for others, who don't just know things, they know how to transfer knowledge. Because they've been doing it since they were 12 years old, sitting at the kitchen table helping a younger sibling with homework they'd finished the year before. But all this responsibility came with a shadow side, something that researchers are only recently beginning to understand about oldest child psychology. You're lying in bed at night, staring at the ceiling, and you're running through a mental checklist. Did I set a good example today? Did I do anything that might have been a bad influence? Am I being the person my siblings should look up to? This wasn't occasional reflection. This was chronic self-monitoring, a constant internal audit of whether you were living up to the impossible standard of being worth copying. This wasn't narcissism. It was the weight of being a template for someone else's becoming. You developed what psychologists call identity performance anxiety, the fear that who you actually are might not match who you're supposed to be for the people watching you. While other kids could experiment with different identities, try on different personalities, make mistakes privately, you felt the weight of being a template. Every choice felt like it was being recorded, studied, and potentially replicated. And this performance anxiety created a paradox that most oldest children never escape, because the more you tried to be the perfect example, the less you knew who you actually were underneath all that performing. Here's the paradox that haunts many oldest children. You were given responsibility before you had power. You had to watch siblings, but you couldn't actually discipline them. You had to set an example. But you were still figuring yourself out. You were supposed to be mature, but you were still a kid. This gap between responsibility and authority created a specific psychological tension. You learned to influence without control, to guide without power, to be accountable for outcomes you couldn't directly determine. This wasn't powerlessness. It was learning that real influence doesn't require authority. Decades later, these are the people who excel in middle management positions and struggle in CEO roles, who are brilliant at execution but uncomfortable with ultimate authority, who prefer collaborative leadership to hierarchical power, because they learned young that real influence isn't about having final say. It's about shaping behavior through example, through consistency, through being the steady presence that others orient around. Now picture family photos. Every holiday, every important event, and you're always positioned in a specific way, often in the back, often slightly to the side, often with a sibling in front of you or next to you. This wasn't random positioning. It was visual representation of your role. You were the frame, not always the focus, the context that made the picture make sense. And you internalized this, not consciously, but deep in your psychology. You learned that your job wasn't always to be the center of attention. It was to make space for others to shine while still being present, still being important, still being part of the structure. What researchers call peripheral centrality. This ability to be essential without being spotlight focused. To know that your value isn't determined by visibility. These are adults who can let others take credit while knowing their contribution was crucial. Who don't need constant recognition because they learned early that impact and attention aren't the same thing. But let's talk about what happened when you failed at something, really failed. In a visible, public way. The disappointment on your parents' faces wasn't just about your failure. It was layered with concern about precedent. If the oldest can't do this, what does that mean for the others? Your failure felt like it wasn't just yours to carry. It was a statement about family capability, about what was possible for your siblings, about whether the standard was too high or whether you just hadn't met it. This wasn't fair. But it was a template burden, and it created something psychologically complex. You learned that failure was never entirely private, that your struggles were always in the context of what they meant for the family system. So you developed something researchers call collective performance pressure, the weight of feeling like your individual outcomes reflect on more than just you. These are adults who struggle to separate their own goals from family expectations, who sometimes achieve things not because they want them, but because they feel responsible for proving what's possible, who carry the weight of representation in everything they do. And now, decades later, Many oldest children are sitting at their own kitchen tables watching their own oldest child navigate what they once navigated. They see their kid trying to be perfect, trying to set the right example, taking responsibility for siblings without being asked. And they feel something complicated. Pride, because they recognize that conscientiousness. Concern, because they remember the weight of it. And the urge to say what no one said to them. It's okay to just be a kid sometimes. You don't have to be the example every moment. But here's the twist that researchers didn't expect. The oldest children who resented the burden the most turned out to be the ones who replicated it with their own kids. Not out of tradition, not because they didn't know better, but because somewhere along the way, they discovered something their parents never told them, that the weight wasn't a mistake, it was preparation. All those years of being watched, of setting examples, of carrying responsibility you didn't ask for, of influencing without controlling, of being essential without being central. It wasn't damage, it was architecture. Think about what you learned. Systems thinking before you knew what systems were. Leadership before you had the vocabulary for it. The ability to see how individual actions create collective outcomes. The capacity to hold responsibility without needing authority. The skill of teaching what you're still learning. The strength to let others shine while knowing your contribution made it possible. Your brain was literally wired for complexity. Strengthened by responsibility, calibrated by the constant awareness of being observed, the observational awareness that felt like burden. It made you perceptive in ways most people never develop. You can read a room within seconds. You can sense tension before it becomes conflict. You can see patterns that others miss because you spent your childhood learning that everything connects to everything else. The persistence that felt like being trapped, it made you someone who finishes what they start, who doesn't bail when things get hard, who understands that endurance isn't about suffering, it's about showing others what's possible on the other side of difficulty. The premature authority that felt like too much too soon, it made you someone who can step into leadership without needing permission, who can make decisions in uncertainty, who can be the calm presence that others orient around because you learned early that someone has to hold the center. The anticipatory guilt that felt like constant anxiety, it made you someone who thinks 3 steps ahead, who considers consequences before acting, who understands that individual choices create collective outcomes, who moves through the world with intention rather than impulse. The identity performance anxiety that felt like never knowing who you really were, it made you adaptable, able to be different things in different contexts, to lead without dominating, to support without disappearing, to understand that identity isn't fixed, it's responsive to what's needed. And that gap between responsibility and authority that felt like powerlessness, it taught you the most valuable lesson of all. That real influence doesn't come from control, it comes from consistency, from being the steady presence, from shaping outcomes through example rather than force. These aren't burdens you need to overcome. They're capabilities most people spend decades trying to develop, and you've been building them since you were 5 years old, sitting on a couch next to your mum, hearing for the first time that you were the big kid now. You're living proof that maybe, just maybe, the weight of being first isn't something to resent, it's something to understand. That being the prototype child doesn't make you broken. It makes you built for a specific kind of contribution, the kind that holds systems together, the kind that influences without controlling, the kind that leads without needing spotlight, the kind that makes space for others to grow while remaining essential to the structure. Your siblings got to be kids longer. They got to experiment without audience. They got to fail privately. They got to make choices that were just about them. But you got something else. You got the architecture of leadership built into your neural pathways. You got the capacity for systems thinking hardwired into how you see the world. You got the ability to carry responsibility as a default setting rather than a learned skill. And decades later, when you're coordinating family gatherings without being asked, when you're mentoring colleagues who don't know you're teaching them, when you're holding the center while letting others shine, when you're influencing outcomes through consistency rather than authority, you're not performing the role of oldest child. You're being what you were built to be. The frame that makes the picture make sense. The steady presence others orient around. The one who understands that the greatest gift isn't being protected from responsibility, it's learning early that you're capable of carrying it.